Good morning. This is Alexandra Talleyrand for the Abolition News Network at the home of Mr. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the most widely read poet in the English-speaking world. He was born in Portland, Maine in 1807, which was part of Massachusetts at that time. His first job was to teach foreign languages at Bowdoin College for $800 in 1829. His father wanted him to study law, but Henry wanted to go in a different direction. Welcome, Mr. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Thank you very much for that awesome, overstated introduction.
Now, Mr. Longfellow, we are primarily interested in what your feelings are on slavery. Since you are from Maine, where there weren't any slaves, what were the feelings about slavery from the citizens of Maine in the 1830s, let's say?
Miss Talleyrand, Portland was split between abolitionists and those colonizationists who wanted to send all the slaves to start a colony in Africa. The faculty at my college just wanted the problem to go away.
All right. Now, we know that you are most famous for your 1860 Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the 1839 Village Blacksmith, and your 1846 The Wreck of the Hesperus, a children's favorite. But we are most interested in when you started writing on slavery. When did that occur?
It was in 1842 that I wrote 7 sympathetic poems about slavery, 31 pages in all. I'll read you the titles. The Slave's Dream, about an African king that was sold in bondage and dreams of his homeland. The Good Part, about a slave girl, the part that shall not be taken away. The Slave in the Dismal Swamp, that's an actual swamp between North Carolina and Virginia, about a runaway slave. The Slave Singing at Midnight, about a hopeless slave singing of Israel and freedom. The Witness, which takes up the subject of the bones drowned in the Middle Passage between Africa and the Caribbean. The Quadroon Girl, you know a quadroon is part white and part black. And finally, The Warning, written 2 decades before the Civil War, about a poor blind Samson slave shaking the pillars of a temple of the Commonwealth till it lies in a mass of wreck and rubbish.
Would you be able to read us one? I know we don't have time for all 7.
All right, I'll read The Slave in the Dismal Swamp. In dark fens of the dismal swamp, the hunted Negro lay. He saw the fire of the midnight camp, and heard at times a horse's tramp, and a bloodhound's distant bay, where will-o'-the-wisp and glowworm shine, in bulrush and in brake, where waving mosses shroud the pine, and the cedar grows, and the poisonous vine is spotted like the snake. Where hardly a human foot could pass, or a human heart would dare, on the quaking turf of the green morass, he crouched in the rank and tangled grass, like a wild beast in his lair. A poor old slave, infirm and lame, great scars deformed his face. On his forehead he bore the brand of shame, and the rags that hid his mangled frame were the livery of disgrace. All things above were bright and fair, all things were glad and free. Little squirrels darted here and there, and wild birds filled the echoing air with songs of liberty. On him alone was the doom of pain from the morning of his birth. On him alone the curse of Cain fell like a flail on the garnered grain and struck him to the earth.
Wow, that's so picturesque. Let me ask, why are these poems not as famous as Paul Revere's Ride or The Village Blacksmith?
They could have been, but my publishers, Carey and Harton, in Philadelphia in 1845, said if they had included them in my next book, it would discourage sales in the slaveholding states. I followed their advice. Meanwhile, my good friend Charles Dickens wrote in scathing tones about the toleration of slavery in the South in his American Notes in 1842.
But you did speak up to save the Union, didn't you?
At the time, I didn't know how famous this would become. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now it is memorized by school children, even though it wasn't exactly that way. The real Paul Revere was only one of many patriots motivated in spreading the word.
Now it turns out that in spite of your Saturday Club literary friends like Oliver Wendell Holmes, you seemed to pick up a major critic in 1849, Edgar Allan Poe. He said your slavery poems were merely abolitionist propaganda. Bloodhounds were never used to chase runaway slaves, and your poems were intended to be used for your negrophilic old lady friends in the North that like people who are black. What do you have to say about that?
Nothing. This was his war against me. He was completely irrational. I predicted he would have a nervous collapse. In fact, Poe did die of brain fever in 1849 after he was found delirious and semi-conscious in his room in Baltimore. I don't want to criticize him for his very dark and gloomy writings. I prefer to be above that. Let The Pit and the Pendulum, The Raven, and Murders on the Rue Morgue be his memorials.
You are very kind to your opponents.
I'll speak up to defend you, Mr. Longfellow, if you're too afraid to attack.
No, Miss Froome, you don't have to.
Edgar Allan Poe was an addicted, delirious lunatic, probably on drugs, but your poetry will always be remembered. Your first imagery of the American Revolution has been written in history. I was one of those children that you referred to that had to memorize the Midnight Run of Paul Revere, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, actually in my history class. Your poetry will always be widely remembered in America. You set the standard.
Thank you, Ms. Flum. This is Alexandra Talleyrand for ANN saying good morning.